Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Cheryl Selman, and welcome to The Love Code, a show that is dedicated to inspiring you to live the very best life you can live, to be open to your heart, to understand that you have the power to create your reality, create your life. The more we are inspired these days, the more we strengthen ourselves, our immune system, and our community. And today we're going to be talking about a really important topic that certainly is very relevant during these times. And let me just say that I invite you to go to my Facebook page, which is What Women Must Know, because that's the name of the first podcast I produced here on Progressive Radio Network. So go to What Women Must Know, because if you like me there, then you will see all the posts that I do, and especially the archive shows that I do. So you'll get to see them and have them and listen to them if you go to the Facebook page. But you can also go to my website, which is drcherylselman.com, and sign up there, because I then can send these archive shows and all the other things that I'm involved with out to you directly. So a great way to stay in touch and not miss a show. So speaking of shows, let's talk about what my show is today. We are going to be talking about our environment and the chemicals in our environment and what you can do to reduce exposures and reduce risk for chronic diseases and infections. And my guest today is Aly Cohen, and she is a board-certified rheumatologist, integrative medicine, as well as environmental health expert living in Princeton, New Jersey. She has collaborated with the Environmental Working Group and other disease prevention organizations and is co-editor of the textbook Integrative Environmental Medicine. In 2015, she created the smarthuman.com to share environmental health, disease prevention, and wellness information with the public. She lectures nationally on environmental health topics for elementary, high schools, colleges, universities, medical schools, and physician training programs, and is a regular expert guest for television, print, and podcasts. Her consumer book, Non-Toxic: Guide to Living Healthy in a Chemical World, will be released in 2020. And she also has done a TED Talk, How to Protect Your Kids from Toxic Chemicals, and you can find that on YouTube. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Cohen to the show today. Hello and welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.
We talked many, many years ago. I had you as a guest on the show, and it's just great reconnecting with you again and seeing all the wonderful things you are doing. And I know you put your heart and soul into this work, and I'm grateful to you for doing that, because this is such a big story. And people may hear, chemicals are dangerous and harmful, and, get them out of your heart. I mean, we hear it, but you know what? I don't think it really registers to the degree it has to register in people's consciousness. Just what a big story this is. What a big story it is, because the exposure to the chemicals in our world, the exposure is driving everything that is compromising our health. Everything. Yeah. It's a big story. So where should we begin?
Well, there's a lot to bite off, but, maybe I can try to start with that same question that you have, is how do you really make people buy in to this topic as being an important topic, and then also how we can actually improve on the situation, practical changes we can make. Because I think when you tell someone a story, you also want to know the punchline, but what to do about it if there's a problem. So, I could do my best to explain it if we want to.
Yeah, let's start there, and then we'll continue.
Okay, so, we do have, in this country, in the United States, we have a pretty, wild, wild west of exposures to chemicals, because if you go upstream, you realize that really since 1950s, when we really had this boom of chemical creation, and everything from pesticides that were raging to, people were coming up with great pesticides to handle wars and overseas. Agent Orange was in that time period, DDT. But we also had chemicals for plastics. I mean, that was sort of the plastic generation, and so we had just thousands and thousands of chemicals that began filling the markets for products. And then we had, chemicals for personal care products and chemicals for cleaning products and chemicals that were used to act as flame retardants for couches in the 70s, a lot of them in the 70s. Primarily actually promoted through the tobacco industry, ironically enough, for those flame retardants. But, we just had an influx of chemicals. So at this point, we have over 90,000 industrial commercial chemicals that are used in everything we do in the United States. And the vast majority, which most people don't realize, the vast majority of those 90,000 chemicals are actually not tested for safety and toxicity, and they end up in the products we love. They end up in shelves with very little to no testing whatsoever, because the laws don't mandate that, especially cleaning products and personal care products. There is some oversight with some pesticides and certainly with medications. The FDA covers those, but the vast majority are not regulated. And the reason that's a problem is because they have seeped into our environment and our commercial environment, our economic environment, but they're also seeping into our bodies. And what we now know is that people are pretty much walking around with at least a couple hundred chemicals in their bloodstream, in their breast milk, in their urine. And we know this through CDC surveillance and data that's collected on the American population through these, government-funded studies.
Well, even fetuses now actually are born, babies are born with chemicals they've inherited from their mother. So everyone is walking around with chemical exposure that's lodging in their cells, in their fat tissue. Give us a story, or give us a statistic. Give us something that really impresses upon people why having these chemicals, which are ubiquitous in our environment now, lodged in our body, is such a serious problem.
So the chemicals that are studied through third-party university, scientific method, we now know that there's different classes of chemicals, of course. There's heavy metal groups and there's plasticizers, and many people who are listening may have heard of phthalates or phthalates, they call them, parabens, things to look for in personal care products that you may not want. So we know there's different classes of chemicals, and what's interesting is we now have so much data nationally, internationally, in the medical literature showing that many of these chemicals can be classified in ways that show what they do to people. So, of course, carcinogens, we know that there are several, many pesticides that are carcinogenic. We know that there are colorings in food chemicals, caramelization, for instance, dark colored sodas, for instance, that are linked, associated with potential risk for cancers because the coloring in animal studies has been linked to development of cancers. But we also have this group of chemicals that's actually gotten much more attention over the last 10, 15, 20 years called endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are chemicals that we now know can affect our human hormones, our hormones that affect thyroid development, thyroid growth. They can affect fertility, which is, of course, hormones related to male and female development of a fetus. We also know that growth and development are based on hormones. We know that bone growth and bone strength, even as women age, is dependent on hormones. And in utero, exposure to some of these chemicals, which are endocrine disruptors, can affect changes in babies when they're born, particularly male babies, that may have changes to their genitalia and to their male male organs. So there's a group of chemicals called endocrine disruptors. There's now over 1,000 of them classified. in that way that really are now a big source of interest, particularly because so many of our personal care products have those chemicals, and so many of our food additives are endocrine disruptors, and so many pesticides are endocrine disruptors. So we're really seeing that not only are they getting into our body, but they can explain a rise in a whole variety of clinical ailments and illnesses, such as the rise of thyroid conditions, such as the rise in certain cancers, which is also hormonally driven, and obesity and insulin and diabetes, insulin reduction and diabetes. So those are hormone-related, effects from exposures. And inflammation. In general, many chemicals can cause inflammation. Not just, endocrine disruption, but certainly an inflammatory response, which ties us back to COVID, unfortunately, but true in the sense that we are generally seeing a very strong inflammatory response for the sickest of the sick people exposed to COVID who end up in hospitals, who also, the majority of which, 80 to 90% of which have chronic conditions, chronic health conditions. So if you connect all the dots, you can see that we have poor regulations on these chemicals that are increasing our risks of a variety of chronic conditions, health conditions, which is exposing us to perhaps a greater inflammatory response when exposed to an insult such as, in this case, COVID-19.
Let's start with obesity. There are a lot of issues, health issues, that are really important that we look at because they are just becoming so pervasive and lead to such suffering. So let's talk about obesity. I think the most recent study said that 150 million people in the United States are overweight and obese, the statistic. That's like half our country.
Yeah.
Overweight or obese, and it's moving more towards obesity. I mean, that obesity is getting stronger and higher in the incidence of how many people are moving more from overweight into the obesity category. Mm-hmm. So you go to your doctor. You're showing you want to lose weight. You have this issue. Now it's starting to show up as diabetes, or maybe heart disease, or, all the conditions that happen from obesity. And you go to your doctor, and your doctor, takes you through all the tests and then prescribes all the medications, but we'll never talk about what really can be driving the condition that leads to obesity in the body. And I think that is where you come in, because there's a big piece that is not understood, it's not addressed, and certainly not given a way to release the toxicity in our bodies if we just rely on a traditional medical approach. So can you walk us through how chemicals can actually be key drivers to obesity?
Sure. So let's go back to those chemicals classified as endocrine disruptors. So several of these chemicals, and maybe your audience has heard of bisphenol A or BPA. People may have heard that it was taken out of baby bottles in 2012 because the science showed that BPA causes a whole variety of health effects, particularly in children and developing children, because it affects their hormones, and they're very young and developing so rapidly. So BPA was taken out of a variety of countries, but also in this country it was only taken out of baby bottles and sports bottles in 2012. Interestingly enough, my co-author for my textbook and for our upcoming book is Dr. Fred von Saal, who you've heard of, and Dr. Salman, because he was instrumental in getting this BPA out of at least baby bottles in this country. BPA, however, is still in hundreds of products that we use every day. And it was something that could not be removed from a variety of other products and uses because the industry fought it so aggressively. And BPA, as an example, one of the most highlighted examples of endocrine disruptors, actually affects not only the endocrine system, but has been shown to affect the human immune system, which are interconnected. BPA has been shown, in terms of obesity, for instance, to not only increase the size of fat cells in our bodies, but also to turn stem cells into fat cells. And stem cells are those really immature precursor cells that come from our bone marrow that end up turning into all the other cells our bodies need as they come out of the bone. So the body is programmed to actually make more fat cells from the stem cells coming from the bone. So we have this process by which it's not just quality of food, perhaps, in junk food, processed foods, but it's the chemicals that are in these processed foods or even in the food packaging that gets into the foods and drinks that we consume that are contributing to this, change in metabolism or metabolic disease, which changes how our cells function in terms of their efficiency. And they end up being part of a metabolic picture of not just obesity and weight gain, but also, again, of diabetes or the inability to use insulin, efficiently. And that's when we get a problem with, long-term risks from diabetes, from kidney issues and weight gain, which is tied into that. So, here's one example of a chemical that is poorly regulated, that is pervasive, gets into pretty much everything we do, but certainly in food products and personal care products, and pesticides, lawn care. Some of these chemicals get into our clothing. And, it gets into our body, and then it has these downstream health effects that, independently of lack of activity, certainly you could argue a sedentary lifestyle contributes. We would all say that. And also, other things like mental health and, socialization and all the other things that contribute to weight gain. But certainly environmental chemicals play a key role, and they're in our food and drink and all the other things that we do on a daily basis.
What are some of the sources of bisphenol A that we don't know of? First of all, the most obvious one of plastic bottles, although some companies are taking them out, but some still have them.
Yeah, we have BPA now pervasively in all canned foods. So, for instance, all cans, whether it's your favorite soda, whether it's your, favorite, organic peas, any canned foods, the majority of them are lined with a plastic liner made with bisphenol A, and this hasn't been changed. A very, very, very small percentage of cans are made with a vegetable-based coating or lining called oleoresin. But that's like 0.01% of the whole canning industry. So every time we take in food, which is actually one of the biggest sources of our BPA intake, it's coming through, our food packaging in this particular case. We have BPA that's on receipts, when we just dermal touching of receipts, because BPA is a chemical that sets ink on the surface of most receipts. Which is why for those two examples, I say, if we can switch to frozen foods, and, that come in a plastic bag and transfer into a glass container to heat it up, that's much better than canned foods. And if we can not receive receipts in our hands and perhaps, get them sent to us electronically or put them carefully in an envelope away from our fingers. There's studies that show that even pregnant cash register clerks have some of the highest levels of BPA in their bloodstream because of their dermal absorption. And that was actually done with pregnant women just to kind of prove the point that we now are seeing this transfer of these chemicals even into the unborn. So we really want to think about some of these behaviors. Most people haven't heard a lot of this information that, you and I are sharing today. So, I'm hoping it'll just kind of not scare people away from making practical changes. It's always a matter of just being empowered and knowing what you know now. How will you do things differently? And I can certainly, talk more about that.
I never touch receipts. I don't really accept them, or, people hand them to me. I just tell them to put it in the bag, but I'm aware of that, and I just don't touch receipts. You know what else has a lot of BPA, I think? You can confirm that. When you get your hot drinks, the lids, the plastic lids, don't they have
BPA is a plasticizer. I can't be specific to, which lids, which stores, is it, one store versus another, but in general, you could argue that many plastics can have BPA. Do they all? Not clear, because there's other types of plastics that are made with vinyl and peat plastic, which is terephthalate. So there's different types of plastics, but BPA is very pervasive. And in fact, what happens with BPA is it actually can make things hard. Phthalates can make things soft. Like in nail polish, you want to have a little bit of softening agent so your nails don't crack. BPA tends to make things hard, and they discovered this back in, I want to say, the 1930s, 40s, when they discovered that these molecules of BPA, when put together, really makes an epoxy, compound, which is hard. Bayer was the company that discovered this. But they were also using BPA, interestingly enough, to fatten chickens back in the 1930s, and that's how they knew that it could affect weight and cause chickens to be larger. It was actually intentionally used in their feed. So, it was taken away from that issue. It was actually used as DES was actually the substitute for that afterwards, believe it or not, the DES medication that was used. Very similar in regards. But, we have a whole history of chemicals that are tried for one purpose and repurposed for another. But bisphenol A has basically been around as long as it's been developed, and it's really gotten a foothold in our world. So, but there's ways to reduce that exposure, and it's not so daunting. BPA has a half-life, or it leaves the body at 50% of its original amount in 6 hours. So, even a couple days away from canned foods, and studies have shown this, a great one from Harvard School of Public Health, show that if you can reduce your consumption of canned foods, you can actually lower the amount of BPA in your urine, which is how it's measured. So these behavioral changes and recommendations, the kind that I mentioned in the guidebook that we have coming out in August, are really just practical avoidance mechanisms, and nothing that costs money, but more about being aware so that you can make better decisions.
I have a question. Is BPA still used in dental sealants for children?
Great question. So bisphenol A, if you go and talk to most of the dentists across the country, they'll say no. The issue is that bisphenol A, when it was taken out of things even voluntarily, it's often replaced with its other sister compound, so to speak, so bisphenol S, bisphenol FB, bisphenol or BPSIP, and there's a whole list of them. And it's like whack-a-mole, because what happens is the manufacturers will market taking this out, and then they'll put a substitute that's very, very similar. What we're discovering now actually is that BPS, one of the most common substitutes, or regrettable substitutions that they call it, actually has the same type of endocrine disrupting activity as BPA, if not worse. So, it's always a matter of the scientists having to chase after the legislative faults that are happening. So, the way to beat this is to be to be informed and to make personal decisions when it comes to, your consumer product and the choices you make. And I think that's why I'm not waiting for the legislation to change. That's not my lane. My lane is to educate people to be proactive on their own.
I remember a study, and I really don't know where it came out of, but they took two families, and they were measuring their bisphenol A levels. And one family just continued to eat as they normally would, buying whatever they wanted out of the supermarket. And the other family was only eating organic foods. That was the only difference. And I think they measured them before. They both were eating out of supermarket only foods, and then the one of the groups then went for 1 week of only eating organic foods. And at the end of that week, there was before they started, they both had high levels of bisphenol A. And after that 1 week of just eating organic food, their bisphenol levels dropped precipitously.
Yeah, and there's actually been many, and I know, there's several studies I can think of that are similar because, this is exactly the point, is that the exposure we now know majority of which comes from our diet, our food, and the quality of our food and how processed it is, whether it has pesticides on it or not. And also our drinking water. I think people don't really think much about drinking water, which is one of my biggest beefs that's, plagued me over the last several years understanding it, is that we get enormous amount of exposure to a variety of chemicals that are not taken out of our water system, our municipal tap water, because it's just not mandated under the Safe Drinking Water Act that still extends from 1976. Only covers 90 chemicals. So we know that there are over 90,000 out there that can get into our drinking water and make their way through, the municipal treatment plant system into our cup. But we don't think about it. And I think it's because it's just too big of a topic for most people. But if it tasted funny or it looked funny, we'd kind of be concerned. But most contaminants will not have a taste or a change in color. So I think we need to think about how do we filter our water, safely and inexpensively? How do we choose food to be cheaper than, the whole high cost of, maybe organics? You can get frozen organics now at big box stores nationally that are far cheaper than maybe 5 years ago. And frozen organics are just as nutritious, if not more nutritious than even fresh organics, because they don't travel. They don't lose their antioxidant, their nutrient value from storage. So yes, you have less pesticides on both, but frozens are actually flash frozen. So they maintain a large quantity of their nutrients, and that's even cheaper than fresh organics. So there's hacks to everything. And I try to, enlighten people, because this was my journey as well, so I learned from this, from drinking Diet Dr. Pepper 4 times a day and Cheez Whiz and Oreos. And so if I can do it, anybody can do it.
And you're here to tell the tale.
I'm here for now to tell the tale. I don't want to jinx myself.
I remember my Oreo days. I remember them well, fondly.
I miss them, but there are nice chemical-free Oreos out there. In case anyone's wondering,
that's right. There are. Okay, so a couple of points we really want to emphasize to people, because I'm always wanting to inspire people with practical steps and practical strategies. So the number one practical step, I would say, and you can let me know if you agree, is really seriously look at getting organic foods. And like you said, they are available. I mean, I was in Costco the other day, and they just have all sorts of organic frozen fruits and vegetables there. The point is, it's imperative. It's imperative to have organic food, because without eating clean food, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be accumulating all these toxins, and it's going to be a disaster.
Yeah, and if it's regularly done and around the clock for many years, I mean, you can imagine these low doses are leading up to greater issues. I mean, I'm seeing as a physician, I'm an autoimmune disease specialist in New Jersey, and I'm seeing more and more young people that are having autoimmune thyroid conditions, or even just abnormal thyroids. Now, that's a problem. We never used to have that 15, 20, 30 years ago, and a lot has to do with our diet. We don't have iodine that's protective to the thyroid in our diets anymore. We all eat with sea salt, but sea salt, believe it or not, has no iodine. So, our dietary changes, our lack of consistency of eating healthy food because we're so busy, we have soccer practice and band practice and kids pickups and work and all that, we really don't have the diet of our evolutionary history and genetics and templates. So, we're really compensating with junk food, which is low nutrient value, low fiber, high in sugar, and high in calories. And, our nutrition is really, lacking. And so, we can't fix everything overnight, but we want to start moving in that direction if we're capable of it. And as you mentioned, there are organics, which means, the only thing in this country that actually has teeth is the label for organic. All natural doesn't mean anything. It's just marketing. But organic does have value in our food, in our food system. So, and even if you don't have access to organic food, because there are certainly parts of this country, and certainly economically, people feel that they can't, reach, that level for food quality in terms of cost, you can also wash conventional fruits and vegetables, soak them in either baking soda or 1 part white vinegar to 3 or 4 parts warm, clean water and soak it, and you'd be amazed how much of the residues of pesticides can come off into that water. So, or you can go to Environmental Working Group's website, ewg.org, I guess they have it's Dirty Dozen Clean 15 list. So ewg.org, and they every year test conventional, non-organic produce from around the country, and they give a list of all the best, the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. So the 15 fruits and vegetables that they found had the lowest amount of pesticides across the country, and then the Dirty Dozen, which is the 12 most pesticide-laden conventional fruits and vegetables. And so you can kind of use that list, to guide what you buy in the supermarket in terms of risk. So, there's ways to do this, and avoidance is one of the key issues. It's food choice and avoidance of the junk.
Now, we're in strawberry season, and strawberries are pretty close to the top of that Dirty Dozen list, aren't they?
Yes, almost every year. In fact, the top of the list is usually strawberries, apples, and spinach. And they just kind of rotate between the top, 3 list. But, yeah, I mean,
so they have to be organic. You have to get organic strawberries.
Yeah.
That's
you
really
have to
imperative.
really think about even frozen strawberries, frozen berries. I'm telling you, some of the big box stores from across the country that, are in every state really do have frozen organic fruits and vegetables that are just delightful to let them thaw out, and they're great on everything. If you want fresh, I think that's really also valuable. But certainly the berries, anything with the skin, peaches, berries, spinach, as I mentioned, and apples tend to have the highest levels of residues on their skin surface. And so you really, even they're difficult to wash off. So, I would argue that if you're going to choose fruits and vegetables that are not organic and fresh, you go with things that have skins like bananas or watermelons or melons or something that has a thick skin, if you had to choose. And that's probably going to be easier to do as we move forward in the season. So,
okay, I just want to briefly mention water because our what comes out of the tap these days is just filled with chemicals and pharmaceuticals and just horrible things. So the system that I just purchased is a countertop reverse osmosis system. Mm-hmm. So it's a reverse osmosis, which usually requires under the counter, but I have one that's on top of the counter, and it is fantastic. It is fantastic because it's probably the reverse osmosis is so effective at taking everything out, even things that can be difficult for other systems to take out. So I just want to mention that because I think we really can never drink tap water, ever. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, if
I think your choice was
you're dying in the desert, you drink it.
Yeah.
But, even in restaurants, go for bottled water, right? I mean, right. I don't mean plastic bottled water and spring water like Perrier, right? Isn't that better?
Yeah, well, listen,
Or
you
maybe.
have to kind of work when you're traveling and you're on the go, and, you have to work with what you got. But the point you're making, which I think is a wonderful point, is that, creating a system for clean drinking water is one of the most important things I believe anyone could do for their household because, you're really starting to, get into the habit of filling up at home, where you know that you have a system in place. And by the way, reverse osmosis water filters are what they used to use to desalinate ocean water, in the Middle East. It's an old technology. It's sort of similar nowadays to what we would call hemodialysis, for dialysis patients. It's incredibly, stringent on how the water goes through 3 different canisters at a very, very slow pace, so that by the time it gets done, those canisters, it drips into a tank, either under the sink or above the sink, like in your case. And so it has to store because it's made so slowly. And the pressure is just not strong enough to clean and get that water out quickly. So it has to store. And reverse osmosis nowadays, my system that I have at home and the one I have now in the office were $275 just to get one. And it's installed for approximately $130 by a local plumber who can put it in 1 hour. It's not brain surgery. And that's it. It's like $40 a year to change out the canisters. And if my husband can change it out, anyone can do it. So, it's one of those systems where once you do that, you don't have to pay for, taking all of these plastic bottles back into your home, which are costly and they affect the earth. So, I would suggest that if people could look into, I don't, talk about brands because of the work I do in education, and I don't want to lose my opportunity for good grants and that type of thing. But it's not hard to find off of Consumer Reports a top 10 list of best RO filters, reverse osmosis filters, because that's how we found our company. And you want it made in America. You don't want it outsourcing its parts to different countries. So really get to know them and understand their process. But again, it's not cost, prohibitive in my opinion, and it pays itself off as compared to water bottles that sit in warehouses in plastic for months before it gets to your refrigerated, Costco. So, or whatever, wherever you buy your bottled water. So it's one of those things that I think is really a smart system. And once you have it in your home, you can fill up your water before you go to work, before you go to soccer games, in a glass bottle or a stainless steel bottle, which we now have like 10 of them in our house. And you just grab a clean one and fill it up and go. Even our pets drink out of, RO filter water. So, so that they don't get any contamination in their bodies. So it's just an easy system. Carbon filters are excellent too. They're the ones that are, on refrigerator doors that need to be replaced regularly, or pitchers, Brita or Zero Water are some of the more common names. And they're very good, but they're not aggressive enough for my taste. Just knowing what can be in water, right, in our national drinking water. Right. So that's just my opinion. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to kind of change tack a bit, and let's talk about some of the other effects from chemicals. I like to talk about depression, anxiety, the effects, the more psychological, you can call them that, conditions that are so prevalent. Even children, there was a statistic where 20% of children are now on medications in schools for depression, anxiety. There's a shocking statistic about how young kids are being medicated. To what degree do you think chemicals play a role in altering our moods in this way?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. I'm glad you asked it. So I think I would love to mention something called the gut microbiome. And if many people may not have heard this, your audience, I'll just briefly tell what it is. Our GI system, our gastrointestinal tract, is essentially just a tube from our mouth to our butt, essentially. And in that GI tract of 24 feet, we have trillions of bacteria, viruses, yeast, molds, and a variety of other flora is what we call it, or microbiome of different microbes that are supposed to live in balance in the gut for that whole 24 feet of bowel. And those bacteria and microbes actually protect the gut and kind of allow good things to stay in the body and, kind of block the bad stuff from crossing that tube into the bloodstream. So our gut microbiome and all of our trillions and trillions of bacteria are really, really critical for not just our immune system, but also for our mental health. And here's why. Because those bacteria actually climb up and down, believe it or not, there's proof of this, from our gut to our brain stem, to our brain material. So we actually know that our flora actually run around our body, but particularly up and down from the gut to the brain and from the brain down to the gut. And our gut is actually responsible for 75% of the serotonin in our body, not the brain, the gut. And so why this is important is that so many things that we do on a daily basis can make those bacteria get killed off. Chlorinated drinking water, chlorine kills bacteria, so why wouldn't it kill it in our guts? Pesticides in foods, food coloring, and certain other chemicals that are in processed foods actually can kill off bacteria and the good guys in our gut. Antibiotics, certainly, but also a whole host of chronic medications that are very common can cut down on the gut microbiota, which are very helpful to us. So what we really, and stress, I'll throw another one in there. Stress changes our acid levels, and that changes the probiotic, or the bacteria in our gut. So we have a lot of things working against our normal gut healthfulness, and one of the ways to manage mental health conditions, just one of them among others, is to really support the gut and try to make what our food is to be clean, to filter drinking water, to manage stress, to get appropriate quality and quantity of sleep, which also contributes to the health of our gut. And so these are just the classic lifestyle changes that can really, make us thrive if we are able to do it. Exercise also helps the gut microbiota. So, it's one of those things where, we can also take medicines, but that doesn't solve the problem. In many cases, not all. We want to go upstream. What makes humans healthy? And that's just a short list of some of the things we can work on to help with anxiety.
Well, that was great, Aly. So let's talk about some of your recommended strategies to help reduce the exposure of all these toxins in our life. And maybe you can also add some of your suggestions of what we can do to clear toxins out of our body as well.
Sure. So in addition to the ones that we kind of went through already, I kind of step back and I say, well, let's go with the low-hanging fruit. Let's go with the stuff that everyone can really take part in that's not cost prohibitive and doesn't mean you have to have a degree in medicine or toxicology. First things to think about are, what do we consume the most of? And that would really consist of food, which we need every day, and of course water or liquids in order for the body to be hydrated. So the first thing to think about is, how do we clean up our diet? Well, the first thing I would suggest is eating a cleaner diet, meaning more whole foods, foods that come from the earth, are unprocessed, don't have chemicals added, aren't in packaging like boxes in the center aisles of the supermarket. Fresh foods tend to be on the periphery. So, even clean meats and seafood, good high quality foods like that. Also frozen wild-caught salmon is now in a lot of big box stores. Frozen organic foods and certainly fresh non-pesticide laden foods whenever possible. Certainly fruits and vegetables that are, on the EWG list or Dirty Dozen Clean 15, that'll help navigate choices as well. And in terms of drinking water, we want to think about how to even filter our water at the most basic level. If you get water from a well versus whether you get water from municipal tap water, either way, I'm recommending people always filter their water, because contaminants are variable in different states, in different townships, how much they're tested, and how much they're regulated nationally, of course. So we really want to think about filtering all water, because you're going to correct that problem at the point of use, which is at your sink. So if you can get as we discussed, a reverse osmotic water filter, a carbon filter in a pitcher, or a faucet apparatus. It's really worth looking into those. And again, EWG.org has a wonderful guide for choosing a water filter. But as I said earlier, reverse osmosis, the one you have and the one I have, that type of filtration is the most aggressive you can get, and they're pretty reasonable in cost, in the $200 to $300 range. They just have to be certified and really good quality, which is Consumer Reports listing if you can find it. Other things, remove chemicals that you buy, things like you buy for, cleaning products that are usually unnecessary, carpet powders, fabric softeners, any number of air fresheners, plug-ins, sprays, things that kind of keep us up with the Joneses that we don't really need. Lawn care that we don't technically need. I recommend just cutting your lawn short and regularly so that you don't actually need to apply any type of pesticides to your lawns, where we track them in with our shoes, our kids track them in, and also our pets. So that's a big starting point. It's mostly avoidance and just making really smarter choices with food, drink, personal care product choices, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's so many areas. I will not use any commercial cleaning products. There are so many natural options. So I've eliminated all commercial cleaning products out of my kitchen, out of my bathroom, on myself, because we forget that our skin absorbs everything we put on it, and all those chemicals go right into our body if they are used as moisturizers or deodorants or cosmetics. So we have to be mindful of just
and
how
feminine care
pervasive
products.
These chemicals are.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, just to kind of round the topic out, feminine care products, we have to think about that as an entry into the body is vaginally, which is very absorptive. And so when you're talking about young, healthy women, young girls starting their menstruation early or, even on time, 10, 11, 12, as early as 8 and 9 now, you really want to think about the products that, these young women are using, because it's a highly absorptive area, and certainly the chemicals are pretty abundant in feminine care products. Tampons have rayon and other plastic chemicals. They have antibacterial chemicals, which are endocrine disrupting. They have pesticides from the cotton used or anything that's added. They have antimicrobials, as I mentioned, but they have fragrance, which are phthalates, endocrine disruptors. So again, thinking about all the routes into the body and trying to control as best we can for the cleanest type of products we can find. And again, even organic in personal care products is very limited. But when you research brands and companies like EWG.org who do this for a living and they vet out products, you can be pretty assured that they're going to give you good information. It's quite a good organization to test your personal care products off of.
That's a great piece of advice. Often we don't think about that and what chemicals and bleaches are in those feminine care products, menstrual pads and all that stuff. So, let's also talk about the toxic exposure from our air. So what do you recommend for people who want to purify the air in their homes?
First thing, great question. First thing is just to not bring it into your home to begin with. So all of the incense candles, or incense and candles, I should say, that are all made with synthetic odors and chemicals to make fragrance last. Those are pretty hard to quantify in terms of what's in them, in terms of any real value to the human body, that's for sure, but they are unregulated, and we tend to bring them into our home. All these fragrance commercials for sprays that cover dirt, odor. I think we should clean better and perhaps not bring in, synthetic sprays if possible. And then we can also create our own products very simply, just using a spray bottle with essential oils that are organic. And, there's really simplistic ways. I actually lay out a lot of these ingredients and recipes for personal care products and cleaning products in this upcoming book of mine. But it's not hard to access a lot of this information. So opening windows, a good 15 minutes, half an hour a day to recirculate the air, cleaning up dust, which makes its way into corners and on the floors where kids can kind of put them into their mouths through their toys, and pets are constantly, absorbing household dust. Dust actually contains an enormous number of chemicals that kind of fall off of our daily products. So again, cleaning better, dusting better, using a HEPA filter, opening windows, and just not buying and using some of these air chemicals in the first place is really just the simplest way to go.
And what about houseplants?
Great question. So there are wonderful studies showing that that certain houseplants more than others, particularly dracaenas, money plant, mother-in-law's tongue, those were the ones that were actually tested in several studies, and they do, to a decent amount, a decent degree, pull some of the chemicals out of the air. Certainly it's based on square footage. You have one plant hoping to clean the entire, 5,000 square foot house. I think you are going to be disappointed. However, if you can have a certain number of plants in small spaces, I think that's where the benefit is. And plants are wonderful. I mean, they do so much for the carbon dioxide in the air, but in terms of chemicals, there actually has been a reduction in VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, in the air when these plants are used and in abundance.
And I also want to add the use of a good air purifier. People who live in cities, people who live near busy streets are not really aware of how many of the small particulate matter, those invisible components of air pollution, which are so damaging to our body, get into your home. And I think everyone should have a really good air purifier. Those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, air purifiers are a great idea. Some of the better ones tend to run a little bit more expensive. When I think about sort of what is the hierarchy of yield in terms of our behaviors and how we spend our money, I tend to look at the most important stuff that we consume first in terms of water quality and food. Air quality, certainly in cities, we now know, pollution, even small particulate matter, is correlating with shortened lifespan, higher, rates of asthma, COPD, and heart disease, stroke, as well as COVID-19, believe it or not, in terms of the severe reaction to it. Not getting it, but sort of, how inflamed we are on a basis of pollution, and how that sets us up for more severe response to infections and other insults. So I do believe it's definitely worth considering an air filter, again, off of type of, a Consumer Reports rating system. But I also believe if you're going to choose where you put your money, it's definitely a personal choice, but I tend to put it more towards consumption of water and and food, and then go from there.
Yeah, you can have your list and just work your way through it over time. As people learn about this, they don't have to do everything at once, right? They can just start with what you were suggesting, and then, and depending on their circumstances and depending on their health. I mean, some people have health problems, or their children have health problems, and it's imperative that they do all the above. And some of us can just add it on as we go along. But it's becoming aware, at least it's getting conscious of what is driving, or at least contributing to the various challenges that we may be experiencing. And I always like being proactive anyway. So,
what could
recommendations
be more important
are great.
For your health? Sure. I mean, this is
exactly.
really becoming a really critical issue moving forward in terms of human health. We're just being really forced into this, into the visibility of the problem, over the last couple of months with this COVID business. And I'll tell you, I think it's just kind of pushing us all to just think a little bit harder about how we live our lives, what we eat, what we breathe, and what changes we can make very simply for ourselves and for our family's health.
Great advice. Great advice. So before we bring this important conversation to a conclusion, I know that you did a fantastic TED Talk. So let's just give people ways that they can contact you and also find out about that TED Talk that you did, because your passion is educating children and you did a great talk for TED. So give us all the different ways that we can learn more about you and be able to get more of your advice, recommendations, your wisdom.
Oh, you're sweet. So the TED Talk was a lot of fun, and it was a bucket list type of thing, and I worked pretty hard to get there, and I enjoyed it. So if anyone's interested in watching that, it's about 13 minutes, and it can be found on YouTube just by typing in ALY and my last name, Cohen, COHEN, on YouTube, TED Talk, or TEDx, actually. In terms of what I teach, even to social media, it's under The Smart Human is my platform, The Smart Human, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Instagram and Twitter, I believe it's at The Smart Human, and of course the website, thesmarthuman.com. And I post Monday, Wednesday, Friday on all things health and disease prevention, environmental health, sustainability, nutrition, exercise, mental health, and I try to really keep it positive and proactive and empower people. So, with a little bit of humor mixed in there, of course. And then, of course, I practice in Princeton, New Jersey. So my website in Princeton for my medical practice is Aly, ALYCohenMD.com. Again, ALYCOHENMD.com. And I see just about everything you can think of. So nothing surprises me anymore. So if people are curious or interested, I'm available.
And it's always wonderful to have a compassionate, well-qualified, integrative, functional medicine doctor. So, and I know you said people fly in from all over the world to see you, so that's such a testimony to the quality of the work you do in supporting people and regaining their health.
Yeah, I think there's a dearth of really an integrative approach to any health condition. I think it's not just medicines, of course, which are very helpful and in their own right, but it's the combination of our lifestyle and appropriate evidence-based supplements and dietary instruction and sleep instruction. I think that's what makes us healthy, is that integrative approach.
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I just want to thank you for the passion you have in your work and for the great message you're getting out there into the world, and for giving us some of your precious time today.
Well, thank you for letting me share all this information with you and your audience. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So thank you, Dr. Aly Cohen. And for all of you listening, thanks for joining me here on the Love Code, and come back every week. And as always, I just want to say to all of you, fill your week, your life with love, peace, and harmony. Bye for now.